And so, Eleanor, thank you for being with us. Please share.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. I got involved in this all because I was doing a biography of my great great grandfather, and this was sort of a COVID project, digging around and discovering all this stuff about, an ancestor that I really had otherwise very little information on. And I discovered this very fascinating story about his relationship with John Brown. Now, Brackett was a sculptor living in Massachusetts. He was very involved with the sort of Boston abolitionists, actually sculpted quite a few of them, did busts of them. And I should say that busts were sort of the currency at the time. I mean, it was sort of how
Mm.
people branded themselves in a way. And you sort of think about instead of images, instead of things from on social media going viral, in a way the busts went viral. So it was a very important thing for people to have these busts. So he was doing these. He did busts of a number of the famous Boston abolitionists. And he sort of comes into this story. He was in Boston, and he happened to catch a glimpse of John Brown, this very impressive looking man, walking the
Mm.
streets of Boston. And it turns out it was John Brown who this was shortly actually before the Harpers Ferry raid. And he was in Boston trying to get funds together for the raid. And this is actually a daguerreotype that was taken of him around that time. And one thing I want to point out, of course, not only that Brackett and John Brown sort of share sort of amazing facial hair, but also that John Brown, up until really just shortly before, this trip to Boston, did not have this. He was clean shaven and ended up growing the beard as a way of disguising himself. Although, of course, he was very distinctive with the beard. But then, of course, a lot of people had beards back then. And so I think it's interesting because, of course, the beard has in many ways become his trademark, as we shall see. So Brackett catches a glimpse of this very impressive person. And he asks someone who it is, and they say, "Oh, that's old John Brown." And he sort of tucks it away in his head. Um, Not long after that is the raid, the failure of the raid, John Brown's trial, and John Brown is languishing in jail, and has this idea that he wants to go down to Charleston, Virginia, and visit the jail, and he wants to do a bust of John Brown because he was so impressed by well, not only what he stood for, but also just the way he looked. And Brackett did not have the money to do that. So he went to a number of the Boston abolitionists. Some of them turned him down. William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips were not interested. And then he went to George Stearns. And Laura's going to talk more about George Stearns. But George Stearns was one of the Secret Six, the six people who funded the raid, the Harpers Ferry raid. And this is after the raid. Brown's in jail. Brackett goes to talk to him, asks him if he can come up with some money for him to go down. And Mary Stearns, actually George's wife, is very enthusiastic about the whole project, and they give him the money. So he travels down to Charleston, and things are very, very upsetting there. I mean, there's just a lot of turmoil. I mean, Brown is in jail. People are, afraid that he's going to be busted out of jail. I mean, tensions are riding high. Brackett checks into a hotel and says that he's from Massachusetts. So of course that identifies him as probably an abolitionist. And he also, lets people know what his purpose is down there. So he's trying to get in. What he needs to do is to get into the jail. He needs to see John Brown in order to make the measurements that he needs in order to create this bust. Well, he just keeps running into dead ends. They just won't do it. Particularly the jailer is adamantly against it. No one wants this. And he's almost ready to give up when the chief jailer has to go to trial for some of the other co-conspirators of Brown. and leaving the under jailer in charge, who was much more sympathetic to Brackett's cause. And so the under jailer agrees to let him go into the jail if he doesn't step over the threshold, so that he can then say that he never let him into the jail cell. So they set this whole thing up, and they have John Brown's lawyer is there in the jail with him, and so Brackett is going to tell him how to make the measurements, what to do, give him the information that he needs. And I just want to read now a little excerpt from one of the accounts. Brackett wrote a lot of accounts about this. This was a kind of very important episode in his life. And this is what he wrote about his encounter with John Brown. Okay, so here he is. He's in the jail. He's looking through the window, through the door. Through the open door, I saw the object of my pilgrimage quietly reading, but heavily loaded with chains. He was sitting in a chair, with both hands chained and his feet chained to the floor. Only those who saw in that miserable prison can have any adequate conception of the moral grandeur of his presence. Everybody and everything was dwarfed in comparison. He looked up from his book when addressed by his counsel and listened attentively to the request conveyed from me. Impressive as the scene was, I could not restrain a smile when his reply repeated the very words of Mrs. Stearns. Nonsense, nonsense. Better give the money to the poor. When Mr. Griswold said he must remember that he was becoming famous and that posterity would like to see how he looked, the prophecy was again fulfilled, and the response became even more emphatic. No consequence to posterity how I looked. Give the money to the poor. For some time, Mr. Griswold labored to change his purpose, but finally turned to me, still standing outside the door, and said, "It's no use. He will not yield one jot. I am sorry for your disappointment, but it's useless arguing further." The moment then had come for the last resort. "Please, please say to him that I have come at the express wish and pecuniary expense of Mrs. Stearns, and that she will be deeply disappointed if I return without the measurements for a bust." I watched his face eagerly while Mr. Griswold repeated to him these words, on which hung all my hopes. As he listened, I could see signs of interest, mingled with surprise, in his face, then a grave thoughtfulness. Presently his hands dropped at his sides, and he seemed lost in thought. Then, lifting his head and straightening himself up, he said with emotion, "Anything Mr. or Mrs. Stearns desires, take the measurements." And so that was how Brackett was able to get the information that he needed in order to do the bust. So there's an interesting coda to this, visit down to Charleston. So he took his measurements, he went back to his hotel, and he was getting ready to go back up to Massachusetts when there was a knock on the door. And while he had been down in Charleston, he had run into an old acquaintance who was a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune. But this reporter was actually masquerading as the New York Herald Tribune, of course, was a anti-slavery publication. But in order to sort of get information, this reporter had been masquerading as someone working for a pro-slavery publication. And meanwhile, he'd been writing these very funny, kind of satiric, acerbic reports on what was going on down in Charleston and sending them back. But things were getting kind of hot for him because this was, people were worried that someone was going to try to spring Brown. They were very upset about the way that they were being characterized and caricatured in a way in these reports. So this reporter knocked on Brackett's door, knowing that he was going back up to Massachusetts, and he said, "Listen, I need your help. I want to help you get dressed for the trip." So he had him take off his trousers, and he produced his report it was like I guess a week's worth of dispatches tied together, and they wrapped them around Brackett's legs, put his clothes back on, and he went on the train and went straight to the to the New York Herald Tribune, to Horace Greeley, the editor, and he said, "I've come from Charleston, and I have something for you." And he took off his trousers, and there it was. So this report then was published as well. And after this, then Brackett, of course, now had the hard work of actually making this bust. And so he, using the measurements, and also, I think, referring as well to that daguerreotype that I showed before yes, this one here. He created this bust, which, as he himself admitted, was somewhat idealized, very heroic. He's sort of eliminated certain details, and I think many people have said that, it sort of puts them in the mind of like Michelangelo's Moses. It's got a very sort of, kind of visionary, far off look in the expression, and it was a very powerful and successful bust, which he then presented to Mary Stearns, who was delighted with it, and he had given her a plaster cast. She had it redone in marble, because this was kind of how things worked then, and had many plaster copies sent to various various people who were interested in Brown. And the bust then ended up having, quite a bit of exposure in the run up to the Civil War. And it was on the Emancipation Day. There was a party in which it was unveiled, when Robert Shaw's Massachusetts battalion was sent off to the war. It was seen, William Garrison was seen with his hand on the bust. And it became a kind of emblem in a way and I think it was one of the first sort of, as I was saying, it's kind of like going viral, one of the first sort of brandings maybe of John Brown as a kind of martyr, fiery, visionary figure. So it was very important, I think, in sort of establishing who he was, what he was, and it became a kind of touchstone, I think, for many people.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.